Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so happy to see my superstar teachers. It gives me great joy to, work with people outside of the ivory tower of higher education. I started off as a high school teacher myself. It's one of my first jobs after undergraduate study. I currently am an assistant professor of African American Studies in the Department of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington. I consider myself more so a Black Studies scholar in that I engage populations, as I stated, outside of the of academia, because K through 12 education is really important to me in terms of making sure that young people have access to Black studies before they get to college. And since my roots were in, community education and high school education has always been a passion of mine. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to continue to be in discussion with you all and in collaboration. Recently, I founded Black Star Rising as a Black History education hub so that I can have, different ways of interacting with broader communities, either through professional development. I have teaching units available now on Black Studies. I'm wrapping up an online course that can be taken independently. I also offer some live coaching and courses as well. And so I'm still building out the Black history curriculum through Black Star Rising, but you can gain access to it, some of it in terms of the foundations of Black studies now. And the way I designed it was so that teachers can feel confident having enough information themselves to teach it to others. Because through Black studies, both inside the academy and in the community, we're often grounded in the idea of each one teach one, right? And that there isn't a hierarchy necessarily in terms of the learners and the teachers. And so I wanted to have something where teachers can learn together with their students, or parents can learn together with their children, or that people can use it independently. And so I had the best opportunity to work with Tracy and the ethnic studies group. And so I'm so inspired by the fact that you all come together on your own independently to, which also broadens access for teachers outside of the state. But I love that you all have done this for Washington State. So kudos to you all. Congratulations on the work you're doing so far.
Thank you. And through working with you previously, so much of what we've created through Washington Ethnic Studies now is based on how you've influenced us. So thank you for that. Amanda.
Hi, y'all. I am Amanda Hubbard. I serve as the board president for Washington Ethnic Studies now, and I'm also a language development teacher at Kimball Elementary for Seattle Public Schools, and I use she, her pronouns.
Thank you. I use they, them, she, her pronouns. I forgot to say. Shweta.
You can't hear a word. There we go.
There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Shraddha Shrude. I am the secretary director. I use she, her pronouns. And I am a math teacher at Garfield High School.
John.
Everybody, John Greenberg, he, him, white. I'm an ethics or aspiring ethnic studies educator in Seattle Public Schools, but also I am on the board of Washington Ethnic Studies now, and also a youth coordinator for the NAACP Youth Council. I'm so happy to be here.
Bruce.
I'm Bruce Jackson. I sit on the board of Washington Ethnic Studies now. I also am an educator at Akikurosi Middle School.
Alexis.
Hi everyone, my name is Alexis Buru. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a 10th grader at Foster High School in Tukwila, Washington. I'm on the advisory board for Washington Ethnic Studies now, and I'm a member of the NAACP Youth Council.
All right, thank you. So just recap, we're going to discuss some of the content of Module 1 from our professional development series. And Module 1 is all about critical race theory and really understanding where race comes from and the historical background. I always say in those modules that people walk around with some type of authority and confidence that race is a social construct, but can't tell you who constructed it or when or how. So we do kind of a crash course in cultural anthropology and sociology, and look at some of the authors that were writing during the European Enlightenment who laid the foundations for eugenics. And so I'll open that up to Dr. Levy and anybody else who wants to talk about. I think everybody here has gone through that module and had those readings. So yeah, let's open that up.
Okay, so I'll start by saying that, you know, your point about race as a social construction is, I think, so important. And it goes back to why I think it was important for the Ethnic Studies Advisory Group initially to think about frameworks and really spend a lot of time on frameworks. Because if your framework is problematic or limiting, then that it impacts what you think are solutions, what the problem is and what the solutions are. And so if your framework is messy, then you're going to have problematic solutions. So for instance, if your framework is that, you know, race is a social construction, then your solution to the problem of racism is to ignore it or not acknowledge it because race is not real. And so what I often emphasize in terms of even understanding what race is that we have to understand race is a power relation. It was constructed to normalize the myth of white supremacy. So if we start there, that race is a power relation created to normalize the myth of white supremacy, and maybe even want to substitute create with the word constructed to normalize white supremacy, then that can help frame how we talk about it as a problem and what the potential solutions are. I think even if you think about in situations like a colonial situation, whereas, you know, there may not be the presence of white folks, but still racial tensions, you know, between groups that are considered people of color, there's still an internalization of human hierarchy and oppression. And that's what race is. And so I think a lot of times when I hear, especially as I guess coming of age where it started, you know, science has started to really debunk the scientific assumption before that race was biological. So now we know that race is not biological. But, you know, people tend to think, well, if we don't acknowledge those differences, then we can move towards color blindness. But if you do that, you leave the power relations intact, right? Of basically white supremacy and dominance at the expense of people who have been racialized as other or people of color. And so I think it's really critical to really tease out, as you stated before, Tracy, in terms of who constructed it and when, because we have all that information. You know, this isn't rocket science, it's not a mystery, but it really forces us to debunk the historical narratives and mythologies we have around the West, the founding of the West, European Enlightenment, modernity, all the institutions that we prize is really a threat. And so I think part of why there has been so much resistance to really understanding what race is, or this pretending that we don't really know, you know, all we can say is it's a social construction, is that it's threatening to think about what race really is and how it operates. This is not to say that, you know, race does not, or the construction of race over the last, you know, 200 years or more did not result in, you know, the formation of communities and identities that are real. And so we also can't dismiss that either. But for me, it's really important the foundation of it is to think about race as a power relation rooted in the construction and maintenance of white supremacy, human hierarchy, and oppression.
Anybody else can add too.
I want to say that I think out of all the modules I've done so far, the first one about historicizing anti-Blackness and race has been really like eye-opening, and I learned a lot. And it also added a lot to my understanding of race because I'm in 10th grade, and last year we did talk about, you know, race and like where race came from in our world history class, and that in and of itself was really interesting to me. But it did feel like there was kind of a piece missing, and it felt like we were still in that like that space of kind of our curriculum being white centered, and like we talked about, oh well, it was also about religion, it was also about this, that, and the third. And when I took that module, like I felt like all those other pieces really started to come together, and it was super just like eye-opening and really cool to really intake that information and like start, you know, putting it together in my real life world and my real life. And I don't know, I just thought it was really like informative for me.
I'm totally with you on that one, Alexis. I felt like I learned so much in that module, and so much in terms of helping to like understand different parts of my childhood and how those pieces fit in together. As a mixed race Filipina woman, and as a child, like it was really hard to understand sort of like where I would fit into history, into the context of it. And so what I really appreciated about module 1 with the contextualizing anti-Blackness was that it helped me understand like how I could be experiencing racism, but I'm not Black, but I'm also not white and not benefiting from like that being part of my background and heritage. But I'm still getting messages about like that being lighter in skin color or being more affiliated with that would benefit me. Like my mom was always chastising us for being out in the sun too long and becoming too dark, or when she realized she would lose that battle because tanning was really in the early 2000s, all the orange people. And so I wanted to be with the tan folk, you know, any way to fit in, right? It's middle school and high school, you'll get eaten alive. And so my mom would just instead result to like this really dismissive, like, and like disgusted, like clucking sound, like when she would see that like her quest to get us to like not be affiliated with darkness was a losing battle.
So in the readings that we use in Module 1, it really outlines how Africans, I mean, the language that they used, especially like Blumenbach and Morton, was Africans are the most degraded because white people, well, quote, Caucasian people, which no white people are Caucasian, were the supreme pure race. And the further away you got from that, the more degraded the race became. And so Africans were the most degraded, right? Asians were the least degraded. And so it's really clear that the purpose of creating race was for anti-Blackness. And then there's a difference between Caucasian and white, or European American and white. And white was that next step, right? So we created race first to create a hierarchy, but most importantly, anti-Blackness. And then whiteness really cemented the definition of being white as being anti-Black. And that's what we focus on in Module 1. And so the next question is, when did Europeans become white? When did we have that shift?
Can I just say something just to build on the last thing you said? I think it's also important to understand and acknowledge that race, the invention of race, is messy. And so it never just meant one thing, you know, it could mean several things at the same time. It changes according to the politics of the time, in terms of who is white, who's the most degraded. I mean, because some of these people, depending on the scholar or scientist who are coming up with these hierarchies of man, there are a couple of them that put Mexicans underneath Black people, or put, you know, so I've seen that, you know, I've seen a couple of types of man where Black people are always still near the bottom, but depending on what's going on, you know, a Mongoloid might be below the African, or a Mexican is below the African. And so it depends on who you're talking about. It depends on the politics of the era, what's going on, in order to sustain those power relations, which I talked about. And so before we move on, I just wanted to say about anti-Blackness too, is that Do you all mind if I share my screen? I do have a couple of slides. Maybe that could help some folks think about.
Please, yeah.
Maybe I'll just start there. I wasn't sure, how we wanted to start, but how we define race initially was, I just said was important because, some people say it's a biological reality, it's a social construct. That's the popular one. But I wanted to move us towards, and I think this is a really important development in Black studies, to think about it as a political invention and a system of governance. Moving on is like defining race as a political invention that assigns meaning to perceived biological differences and uses those differences to justify unequal power relations. So again, depending on the politics of the time, those types of types of man might, talk about, for instance, that indigenous people can be trained into whiteness or assimilated into whiteness. Or that they might need to be annihilated for obvious reasons in terms of a grab for land and dominance. I just wanted to move on to one slide in terms of thinking about the Age of Enlightenment before we move on. Ibram Kendi and Stamped from the Beginning, it gives a really good overview of this history. It's a long book, but there are a few chapters that you can pull from to kind of trace all of these people like Blumenbach and so many others. It's amazing some of the connections that he makes between, peoples, between generations. And so he then argues that, it's important for us to understand that racism itself doesn't come from ignorant people. It comes from the educated. It came from the scientists. It came from the elites. And so again, if our framework is problematic, then we tend to think that racism is a result of ignorance and all you have to do is educate people. No, that wasn't the case. It's never been the case. Like it's convenient for people to maintain race and racism because it's some kind of economic, social, or psychological self-interest involved in it. And so, his book really points to the fact that race is invented and it evolves in order to justify racist policies of the era. Moving on to this slide in terms of the Enlightenment, we tend to think of the Age of Enlightenment from the 1630s to the 1780s. And so I put over here on the left side, those concepts that teachers might, bring to the classroom: reason, liberalism, rights, freedom, nation state, scientific revolution, market capitalism, philosophy. And so the Enlightenment marks the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of modernity. The Enlightenment emphasized reason, order, beauty, natural science, and human progress. And it's during the same time that race is invented, right? And so according to the types, as scientists are ordering the natural world, they're starting to order humankind conveniently to benefit certain groups, but, assigning beauty and reason to certain human types. But if you look at these years, 1630s to 1780s, this is a moment, an era of genocide, of mass genocide and racial slavery. That the first time in human history that slavery is, as everyone knows, that slavery has always existed in human history, it seems, but it's the first time that it was assigned to racial meaning, or racial meaning was assigned to slavery, and that it became hereditary, that it was a marker of your very humanity, that people who were enslaved were then dehumanized, were kind of written out of the human category altogether. And so there's no way in the world you should be teaching the Age of Enlightenment and not teach the fact that racial slavery and mass genocide was absolutely essential to the making of the New World. In relation to that, I pulled this image again in terms of thinking about the invention of the other. So these are like, some people might have believed in us that each race is of a separate species. And that was only confirmed finally recently with some of the stem cell research and stuff that is verified that humankind has descended from Africa and that we have one origin. I mean, people would still believe in that in the 20th century, in terms of having multiple origins, but you can see how, once you get to African, that there's this dehumanization even further, as if you descended from apes and monkeys. And so it's no coincidence that this happens during the same time where you have the escalation of the transatlantic slave trade, all right, which was the foundation of wealth for new European nation states. And so I think in terms of thinking about anti-Blackness, I also usually teach Black Lives Matter in terms of how the movement, or at least the founders of the Black Lives Matter network, really focused on the two essential problems, which were anti-Black racism and state violence. And so I challenge my students to think about, why did they say anti-Black racism and not just regular racism, or not even white supremacy? And what does a concept like white supremacy assume? You know, so we use that white supremacy assuming that, you know, for some people that white people are supreme. So we got to make sure we use the language to say this is a myth. But to really focus on anti-Black racism, and I want to suggest that what was a really critical ideological intervention, as the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opa Tometi initially formulated it as an ideological intervention to say that we have this problem of anti-Black violence that was born in racial slavery, right? And then everything that came after that with Jim Crow, that's so much a part of the fabric of this nation that even as people immigrate here from other places from around the world who are not European, assimilate into a culture that is rooted, that's really grounded and invested in anti-Blackness because of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and racial discrimination. And so the anti-Blackness piece, I think, is really important. There is a book that I have not read yet, but I wondered if you all engaged the book or any chapters of The History of White Folks. I want to say it's Deborah Gray White. She wrote a wonderful book, and I could be confusing it, about Black women in slavery called Aren't I a Woman? And so it kind of focuses on, let me see if she's the correct author. Well, I'll find the book and put it in the comments, but yeah, The History of White People, not Deborah Gray White. Sorry, I'm glad I looked it up. Nell Irvin Painter, Nell Painter, who's also a Black women's historian, and she wrote, Deborah Gray White wrote Aren't I a Woman? Nell Painter wrote The History of White People. And so there may be something there from a Black woman's historian's perspective in terms of archiving when white people become white, you know? And so for so long, you know, well into the 20th century, definitely in the 19th century, there is a lot of messiness and it changes, you know? And so we do know, and we talk about this in public platforms, that the Irish were not white for a while, the Jewish were not white for a while. And what's interesting is that somehow in order to assimilate or achieve the status of whiteness is predicated on anti-Blackness. So one example that I could think of that can come into the classroom is thinking about the history of minstrel shows. So during a time where the Irish or the Jewish were not considered white and were also dehumanized or just suffered discrimination, it was interesting to see that those who performed, like the popular performers of Black minstrel shows, were Irish and Jewish, you know? And so in creating the first popular event where you get dressed up and go to, you know, to an event in pop culture as the minstrel show, you know, has this weird engagement with the hierarchy of whiteness, whereas people who are sort of degraded in that hierarchy as Europeans can take on whiteness in a way by denigrating Black people. And so I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you all actually encountered in the module. And so I apologize if I'm repeating some things.
Nope, you're building on it. We talked about, in the module, we cover Bacon's Rebellion and the coercion used by the elite, the manipulation used by the elite to push European folks into that shared whiteness identity so that they can have power and control over Black enslaved people.
And I would just lastly say that another way to teach like the era of enlightenment and how all these things coincided or depended on racial slavery and mass genocide is to also think about the revolutionary era. So, you know, in the 1700s, you have then the development out of the Enlightenment with the French Revolution, or the American Revolution, French Revolution. But then do teachers teach that without teaching about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution? you know, and there's so much about race that's embedded in that. How the United States responded, how Thomas Jefferson responded. And so there's just a wealth of information there that builds on this construction, which is always evolving in terms of how people, you know, so it's not necessarily solidified in the 1600s, but you definitely see in the law a distinction is starting to be made between Black people and white folks, Black women and white women, in relation to slavery. And so even just the Haitian Revolution, do people know that Haiti had to pay France reparations for 100 years? You know, they paid reparations for that revolution for 100 years. And we just say, oh, hey, Haiti is the, you know, the poorest country in the West. You know, they had to give all their wealth to France well into the 20th century, you know, and somehow that doesn't make it into the curriculum. What is that about?
Also, the embargo the United States had against Haiti because they didn't want to encourage their enslaved people to have an uprising, right? So we refused to do any business or trade with Haiti. So we kind of had this conversation earlier today. I facilitated a module on intersectionality, and we had an extended conversation about, are Jewish people white or people of color? And that's something that I run into a lot in this work, where Jewish people position themselves as people of color because they experience anti-Semitism. And to me, the definitive answer is there are Jewish people of color. There are Black Jewish people, there are Mexican Jewish people, there are Asian Jewish people. And so how, you know, this, you're right, I agree with you, it's messy, but do we really define white in terms of skin color? How do we define white, and why do we define it that way?
One thing that reminds me of was a while back, Tracy, you'd written something about why you, rather than calling it white supremacy, like to call it whiteness. And I think that kind of is where my mind goes to it. And it's because you don't have to necessarily be of white skin color to be engaging in whiteness and to be perpetuating white supremacy and to uphold anti-Blackness. But it does, you know, when I'm thinking about like who is white, I start to get really, I feel like it's a really nuanced thing, because I remember this one instance happened. It's not a standalone instance, but I saw an article a little while ago that said how the Armenian peoples became white, and it was very similar. Like that's happened more recently, right? Then, and in the article they were comparing it to how the Irish people became white, and then mentioned how Jewish people became white, and so much of right now, especially in Seattle, right, we're seeing all this in Seattle public schools, anger against the highly capable cohort, and why, you know, oh, you all must also hate Asian people, and one because they're succeeding in higher numbers in the highly capable cohort as well. And it reminded me of this instance where we did surveys at our school, the school climate surveys, and I got this feedback back from the company that I guess our district or school used, and it said, you know, there are 7 white and or Asian students who see you as a trusted adult in the building, and then it had all of the other races as well, but like it had clumped together white and Asian. And it got me thinking about when we start clumping together groups, right? Like Dr. Levy said at the beginning, Levy said at the beginning about how race is very much, we kind of change the definition as time goes on to fit whatever, you were talking about anti-Blackness, and I don't want to misquote what you were saying. When you're saying kind of how there were times where Mexicans were set to be lower than the Africans in that like racial hierarchy. And that's what I'm trying to reference. And I'm wondering how much of that leads into this idea of who is white, because it made me so uncomfortable to see my Asian students clumped together with my white students as though they lived the same experiences at our school, especially at Garfield.
And this idea that if you experience success, you are equal to white people, right? What does that mean?
Yes, and it's going back to that question of power. So if you want to access power in this nation, then it makes sense. I think a lot of immigrant groups, including some African immigrants, have sort of tried to distance themselves from Blackness and maybe push their children to, try to assimilate into whiteness because they want them to do well. There's this assumption that will lead to power and influence and money or access.
That reminds me of what Amanda was saying at the beginning when you were talking about your mom not wanting you to get dark, and the assimilation.
I mean, yeah, we were explicitly, told to only speak in English. Like Tagalog was an absolute no-go, and like to what end? It's not like I was trying to go speak Tagalog ever in my life. I was just trying to learn it in my house when I knew my mom was trying to have conversations that she didn't want me to understand because she knew that she could do that too. And so there's layers. But yeah, there's that. It comes down to like, how has society really defined success? How are they marketing success to us? Mm-hmm. And in that consumption, we're creating a certain kind of product.
I want to also say that in terms of thinking about like Jewish people and whiteness, is so incredible what's happening just recently in terms of like a right-wingism that has impacted Israel. And if, even just the ideologies around the idea that Israel should be a white state, or that ethnicity defines your Jewishness. And unfortunately, we're not able to have conversations about it without some of these, I can't say the extreme, maybe the mainstream tends to say that it's anti-Semitic to have these conversations. I didn't see it for myself until I visited Israel about 2 or 3 years ago. And it was, as you stated, just the way that other Semitic people, like Palestinians who are also Semitic, are just the way that is normalized or legitimized in terms of the dehumanization of them, and also the way that Ethiopians have been treated. So even for me to raise the question about Ethiopians who, trace their descent or their line through Solomon or what have you, there's a lot of resistance and hate towards that. I think about it in terms of Donald Sterling. I don't know if you already, not Donald Sterling, who's the other one who's the, who owned the basketball team, and he got caught on video, on audio, talking to his girlfriend about why she's hanging out with the black players, and he said, black people are treated like dogs in Israel. Black people are treated like dogs in Israel, and no one picked that up. No one talked about that. And so going over there and seeing it in terms of what has been denied to Ethiopians because of racism, basically, or this idea that you can only follow your Jewish line through the mother, kind of reminded me of slavery in terms of how racial slavery was then hereditary through the mother, where British law, it was through the father, your status. And so what's interesting to me in terms of the relationship, for instance, between Black people, and like when we talk about Black and Jewish relations, it's often about anti-Semitism among Black folks. And the reality is that Black people, I think Chris Rock might have said this in a stand-up show, it's like Black people ain't slicing and dicing white people up. Like they see the Jewish folks as white, who are the slumlords of the ghetto, or who are in positions that are economically oppressive. They see them as white. So then nobody's really sitting around talking about, oh, these Jews. And if they are, they're talking about it in relation to whiteness, that they have assimilated into whiteness and therefore are occupying an exploitative position. But it's interesting to also account for the fact that you do have resistance among some Jewish scholars and Jewish elites, maybe, who were resistant to affirmative action, for one, with some real concern about how quotas were discriminatory against them because of anti-Semitism. But then the resistance to expanding affirmative action to Black people in particular, you know, that they rallied around themselves and became very white in how they acted in terms of their resistance to affirmative action. I've also seen this in terms of resistance to ethnic studies. And so some of the resistance in some places, particularly in California, came from Jewish folks who said that if you're not going to include us, then there is no ethnic studies. It's like, wow, how white of you to act that way, you know? And again, people are not talking about white people in terms of your skin color or who you are biologically. It's about that mentality of, you know, colonialism. And that's what ethnic studies is grounded in, is to recognize and study race, the fact how racism and colonialism has shaped our ideologies, has shaped our institutions, and shapes the way we think, you know? And so it's interesting in terms of how white some folks are, but that Israel piece, we can't even talk about it without getting in trouble. And that's how deep the propaganda is, because there is definitely a pro-white nationalist parallel to what's happening here in this country, what's happening in Britain, you know, like a white nationalist global charge that I definitely saw in Israel when I visited there myself. And it was so demoralizing and disturbing that I couldn't eat for 5 days. I was that disturbed by what I saw over there. And the fact that we're not able to talk about it without being silenced is another, I guess, manifestation of how whiteness works.
Yeah, so in module 1, we define whiteness as anti-Blackness. Like, that's how we define it. Whiteness was invented for the purpose of anti-Blackness. So I'm glad you said that. Bruce, did I interrupt you? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wonder, when did Jews become white? I mean, if Jerusalem is the homeland for Jews, that's not a region generally considered to be white. You know, so I mean, all descriptions of Jesus Christ have him as woolly haired, and I mean, I keep trying to find this out, but I guess that's a block in history that people are trying not to acknowledge. But I got to figure the original Jews just as black as Jesus. so where does this disconnect happen? And I mean, I can't find it. I mean, what I know, if you go to Jerusalem now, you go to Israel, you're going to find a whole lot of white folks. Yeah. And you're not going to find very many people of color at all. And the ones who are people of color are being exploited by those white people. There must be a point where things changed.
Well, I think it changed in the establishment of Israel as a state following World War II, where we don't call it Palestine anymore, we call it Israel. And so the people who were able to get access to either money, jobs, housing, those things were discriminatory against Arab Jews and also Ethiopians, who just, you know, were not allowed to come back home in the same vein. And had they been fighting, they've had their own you know, movements around that, including the Black Panther movement there in relation to it. So I think someone I know is publishing a book about the Black Power movement in Israel, or the Black Panthers in Israel in relation to that. And so, yes, it's a recent development in the 20th century. And I think the fact that the American government gives billions of dollars to Israel every single year is a fact of the whiteness to a certain degree. Now, that doesn't mean that you know, at times, depending on the circumstance, the Jews are not going to be white, you know, and definitely have been targeted recently with the rise of white nationalism in this country. Is probably a reality check for a lot of Jewish folks who might have assimilated into whiteness in the United States. And so I just think it's also in relation to power, and it varies in different contexts, of course, and depends on who you're talking to. And so it's just really it's not that clean cut to say, okay, they're white, you know, during this time or whatever, but they do have quite access as a group in ways that's complicated, you know, by the reality of anti-Semitism for sure, and continuance of violence that's targeted towards Jewish people. But then there's no room to talk about that whiteness that they actually assimilate into and that they willed in different communities against Black people or against people of color or against the Palestinians. And so it's interesting. You're not going to find an answer.
I want to make sure
find a few people to talk about it.
I want to make sure Amy's question is answered in the chat, and I know Tasha answered some of it, but I'd like to pose the same question to Alexis as a Black student. And Amy's question was, when teaching about the history of race, how do I hold the impact of this info might have on my Black students as a white educator? So I'd just like to hear a little bit about what you think about that, Alexis. First of all, have you had white educators who address race in the classroom, and how do you feel about the way they address it?
Yeah, I have had teachers address race, more so like in recent memory. Like I don't really remember how race was addressed in middle school. It was more like when we talked about slavery, and it would be that kind of like generic, this was terrible, like, yeah, we know it was terrible. And so now that I am like more cognizant and really more critical of my teachers, I would say that definitely what Dr. Levy said in the chat, like it has to be paired with you know, resilience and power, not just the oppression. And also like don't try to speak on something that you don't know just because you think it's right. Like, you know, you have to do the work to educate yourself, and then education is like, it's not a linear thing. And I think that when students see that you care about, you know, providing quality content and actually, you know, doing more than just teaching whatever's going to be on the test, then that will show through, and making sure that the messaging is in the right, like in the right light, it's framed the right way. And I think that it what Dr. Levy is saying is true. It's like, just because you mention anything regarding race, like it's not this kind of catastrophic, oh my God, I'm traumatizing my Black students. Like it's not really like that. As long as you are, you know, coming from a place of wanting to teach well. And I think a lot of times some teachers come from a place of like, oh, I just have to teach it, so like it doesn't matter. Like they don't actually do the work, they don't actually know what they're talking about. And so you being here like is that first step, and like keeping that same type of energy is important, as well as just like framing it along with resistance and resilience.
Thank you. And then I'm going to ask the same question of John as our token white guy. And you've been teaching about race for how many years?
It's been morphing, but since maybe 2002 is when I started this race unit, before I even heard of the concept of ethnic studies. And it has been continuing to evolve based on student feedback in part. And I honestly, like, I view, I want to make sure I'm saying this without misspeaking, but like, my barometer of success is not the white students in my room and how they feel. It's how my students of color, and especially my Black students, feel, and making sure it's a worthwhile experience for them. And I feel like one of the biggest indicators that I am doing damage is when I can't get the white students to give a crap about it, when they can just stay apathetic about racism that is just so powerful, such a powerful force on so many people. So yeah, I feel like it's a huge responsibility, but I'm always going to want to center and make sure my Black students are doing well. And that's my first concern. And so just constantly checking in to making sure that there's more help than harm that's happening in the classroom.
I also want to echo what John just said, and also what Dr. Levy put in the chat. Like it is a huge responsibility. I feel like coming into the classroom with that frame of mind is important, like knowing that, this actually matters. Like of all the things that you could possibly teach, like what you teach in when talking about race and ethnic studies, like that is something that is bigger than just, you know, just the test, just the classroom. And personally, I've never experienced like a teacher kind of singling me out when talking about race or slavery or whatever. And so I didn't think of that at like first glance, but that's super important because I hear a lot of times like students who are in predominantly white schools in their classrooms, they will be like singled out, or even if the teacher doesn't single them out, the environment is not conducive to like a safe space. And so when they talk about whatever they're talking about, you know, that student will, you know, get stared at or get asked questions about like, well, what do you think? What do you think? And like, what's your opinion on this? And that's not okay.
I always like to say too is we frame the conversation about race incorrectly, because when we frame the conversation around race and racism, we center people of color when we should be centering white people in that conversation, because white people created racism, white people created racialized slavery, white people created all of these systems of power that they restrict other people from joining and that they benefit from. And so I feel like when you frame it as a white people problem, and then you focus the resistance and liberation on what people of color are doing, right? I feel like that takes some of the you know, looking at the one black kid in class when we start talking about race, right? Then we have to think about ourselves, like Tasha said in the chat, as racialized people, as people who identify as white, you are racialized also. So just kind of turning that mirror onto whiteness itself is how we should be addressing race in the classroom.
Interesting. I remember, oh, Bruce, go ahead. No, seriously, Bruce, go. You've talked a lot less than I have.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say, yeah, it creates new heroes. That when you center the cruelty of racism, it creates new heroes in kids' minds. It changes the perspectives that education comes with. Yeah, that's what I wanted. I just, when I think about the way that Harriet Tubman has been treated in history, I want people to know who she is and what she did. I think she's an incredible human being that is deserving of our praise and deserving of being passed, having her history passed down. And we spend maybe a sentence on her in most schools. And that's a tragedy. And there's so many other people that are as powerful as she is, who are being ignored because the focus is on what rich white people did. And that's wrong. You can't praise something that bad and expect your country to be something more than it is right now. And I'm preaching, I'm sorry.
That kind of reminded me, actually, just while you're speaking, when I have learned about, this is just kind of a note, I guess, but when I have learned about Black liberating, Black activists and folks who have been in that liberation movement, something I have observed is that I don't know their whole names all the time. I tend to know their first name. I know Harriet Tubman as Harriet, but yet I know George Washington as President Washington. I know Benjamin Franklin as Franklin, right? Like I know these white men through these honorifics, but all of these Black, you know, incredible Black scholars that I'm learning about somehow are always introduced in this more like, I don't know what the right word is, but not using their honorifics. And it's fascinating to me because in people of color communities, informal, yes, thank you, Alexis. In people of color communities, honorifics are huge. We don't go up to our, you know, uncle, I have an uncle Ricardo, I'm not gonna go up and be like, hey, Ricardo, be like, uncle. I don't even say their first name. We just refer to them as their honorifics. It's almost a, you know, degradation of scholars of colors, and, you know, in my experience, Black scholars, by using their first names. And it's a strange little microaggression that we as teachers can throw in there and teach our students without even realizing it. And that just popped into my head when Bruce started talking about Harriet Tubman, and I thought about the movie, and I was like, oh yeah, I know these things, some of these things about Harriet Tubman, but I remembered it because of her first name and not her last name.
That movie was terrible, by the way. It teaches you nothing about her. And yeah, I agree, she's a genius who couldn't read or write, you know, but that one, Birth of a Nation, oh, it's so the new Good Lord Bird about John Brown, who's one of my favorites in history. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't read, you know, and so you think, well, you'll watch the movie, a documentary, and you'll learn stuff. And these movies are actually teaching wrong information when the truth is dramatic. The truth is dramatic as hell. And so
that makes me think of Lovecraft Country. John and I watched it. and I feel like that showed more truth than some of these like historical you know, what do they call them, biopics or whatever, right? Like that was a science fiction show and it had more truth in it than these other shows.
And then you can use novels. As a historian, I'm just starting to use novels like to get to the truth. So I've just started to realize that you can put so much truth in a fictitious story. But the other one that I really liked that OWN is going to put on TV that I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much from the historical record in here is the series Underground, which was actually produced by the same person who produced Lovecraft Country. I forget her name at the moment. Thinking about names. I forget her name at the moment.
And it has the same actor, right? Letty?
Yep. Journey Smollett. I remember her name. Misha Green, I think, is the name of the person who created Lovecraft Country, created Underground. The other thing that I started to do with myself is that I don't recognize people's faces. And so while I might know a lot of Black historical names, I wouldn't be able to pick them out in a lineup. And I started to recognize, I'm like, why I don't know what this person looks like. And so I'm starting to use photographs or just try to find the photographs and make sure I include them every time I teach.
Oh my gosh, how many times are the photographs? This is something that I remember growing up having this happen. My teachers would take pictures. It wouldn't actually be the person. It would be the actor who played them in some movie. And so then in my head, I have this image. My image of Malcolm X is not Malcolm X. Like that is what happened. It took me going to college. Yes. Yeah. Because that's what my teacher used in class. So that's what it was in my head. And it took me until I went to college and I read this book and I was like, oh shit, that's not what I thought Malcolm X looked like.
Yeah, that's not it. Now, this is the first picture I've ever seen of Ida B. Wells right there.
Yeah.
And I've heard her name a million times.
Oh, you muted yourself.
I muted myself just in the middle of my sentence. Yeah. So, yeah, I've heard her name a million times and never knew her history until I sought it out and found out who she was and why so many schools are named after her. I mean, this is another person in history that should be remembered that, you know, maybe you'll get a sentence, you know.
It makes me think too, we did I think it was when I went to Montgomery County with Marquita when we were forming the Center for Racial Equity. And they talked about how even in history books, when they do talk about Black activists and include pictures, they all are pictures of them looking old and tired. Like Rosa Parks and like Dr. King, and people aren't realizing that these were young, like in their 20s, sometimes as, oh gosh, I can't remember her name. The Black woman who predated Rosa Parks was only 15, right? When she started activism. Malcolm X was in his 20s. He was probably one of the older ones when he started because he was in jail or in prison before that. So yeah.
All this also makes me think about timelines and the dissemination of information. Like when Dr. Levy was giving us that sort of like whirlwind history lesson on contextualizing how like racism was like very carefully constructed, was scientifically backed. And then I started to think about, well, then how did that information enter into the like mass consciousness? And then I started thinking about who had the privilege of reading, who was giving out the information, because all of that is also really new, right? Like Charles Dickens was still fighting against child labor. There was not schooling happening for the masses. And so to be at this point in history in public schools, right? Like we are very much still in the middle of an experiment here and trying to like combat these forces that have been shaping the human world for so long. And so on the one hand, it feels like, God, we are so behind. Why we need to have been better than this. And then on the other hand, you put it on a timeline and you're like, it hasn't been that long. Like, how long have we been allowing people to read? How long have we been like distancing ourselves from churches in which like the only way that you would be reading the Bible, right? And then you think about the translation of the Bible and you get back to that question of like, when did Jews become white? And so like all of these things are so very interconnected, and it comes down to now that like we are public school teachers, what is our role in that dissemination of information? How are we engaging people in these relatively new to us resources?
Yes, one thing that came to mind, I know we're running out of time, is another maybe creative way to teach race during the Enlightenment and anti-Blackness is to do it through the whitening of ancient Egypt. And so prior to the Enlightenment, it was common knowledge that Egypt was an African civilization. And like, even though race did not exist as a concept, the argument is that if race existed at that time, these people obviously would be defined as Black. Like dark Black skin does not define you as Black in the United States. You can be brown, you could be high yellow, you could be white and still be defined as Black in the United States. But somehow brown skin, even dark brown skin in Egypt, you know, so it was the ancient Greeks knew it, you know, they wrote about it. People wrote about these people, these Ethiopians they were referring to them, which meant dark skins, okay? And so part of the invention of race was dependent on racializing the Egyptians as white, thereby denying that that Africa had contributed to anything to civilization, let alone the foundations of Western civilization. That information and scholarship is out there with Samuel Morton, who was the founder of anthropology. You all Glidden, there's a bunch of books online that you can find. I think Ibram Kendi's book might deal with some of this as well in terms of the debates around Egypt, which is still with us in popular culture in terms of whitening Egypt, so that, you know, through all the movies, all the images, you're going to see Cleopatra, you know, as a white woman, even though, you know, it's messy, but that's another way to kind of engage. The invention of race was absolutely founded on this propaganda and this mandate to racialize the Egyptians as Caucasian and not African.
Yeah, there's a reading included, I think it's Bernier, who calls Northern Africans accidentally Black to kind of justify that they're not really Black, it's just by accident, right? And so it's the you know, the technology and the science of the Egyptians, but also that's like a trade route. Like there's historical trade between Europe and North Africa, and so they can't admit that they worked with and benefited from Africans unless it's just by accident that they.
I know it's illogical. Race and racism is illogical, right? Down to the point of the Egyptians themselves painting themselves in variations of Black and dark brown, and they say, oh, it's because it's so old. Well, why the yellow survived, the white survived, the blue survived, you know, the old, you know, over time, but the brown, dark brown, darker than me, red brown, Alexis Brown, Bruce Brown, all up in there, in those anyway. And now I'm preaching.
Okay, we're out of time. I feel like we could talk about this all night, and that's something that we talked about today. And the modules are 2 hours, and they're still too short, right? I thought people would be tired after 2 hours, but people are like, we need more time. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and this has been recorded. I'm going to put it on our YouTube channel. Yes, Washington Ethnic Studies now has a YouTube channel. We're becoming more and more legit every day. So does anybody have anything to say or add at the end?
No, okay, thank you for bringing us all together.
Yeah, thank you. This is my favorite part of doing this work, is coming together and just having these conversations. What's the website again, Tasha?
Which one?
Yours.
Oh, blackstarrising.com.
Yeah.
So please just sign up for the newsletter, because I do have a bunch of stuff I'm going to roll out, especially before Black History Month. And so thank you for your support on that.
Yeah. Anybody else have final thoughts? Okay, be sure to follow WAESN on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's at WA Ethnic Studies for all three. And then y'all know our website, and that's where you sign up for the modules. Once you take and finish module 1, then I'll give you our secret link to register for modules 2 through 9. I know module 1 is mandatory because of all the discussions that we've just had. You can't teach ethnic studies without this foundational understanding. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much. See you later, everyone.
Thank you.